Pivot a Wellness Project, Day 15, January 15th, 2021. The question is, how do you show up as a leader in your life? And more specifically, what is self-leadership for you? In the grander context of things, we grow up being born into this world where our parents are rearing us to become adults, and they are primarily the first metaphoric leader in our lives. And community of parents in our lives are our first leaders. As we enter school age, teachers become our leaders, and our teachers and coaches and leaders within clubs and churches and things that we're members of throughout our youth become that extension of that mother father figure, that extension of the grandfather grandmother figure, and ultimately they become proselytizers for us in many respects, because they're supposed to guide us to gain skills so that ultimately when we become adults, we take over to become leaders in our own rights, whether it be parents, whether it be ultimately grandparents, or whether it be leaders in our workplaces, our organizations, or teachers as well. So the notion of self-leadership is really the nuts and bolts of what we learn throughout our youth so that we can become masters and master practitioners in our adulthood so that we can guide ourselves into our own personal sense of well-being and success. So within the pivot wellness mindset, how do you pare this down in terms of self-leadership? Because there's a number of context like concepts that are universal within learning and teaching, but really there's five that I'm going to speak to this week. The first is that all processes have some form of self-reflective practice. And within that self-reflective practice, it's identifying what it is. There's something to be learned. And within that, in the self-reflection, oh, I don't know that. The second stage is actually the objectification of the problem set. So in recognizing you don't know something, then you can see that perhaps there's a pathway towards potentially researching or learning or being told what it is that you need to know. In that, there's a third stage, in which case, in the absence of knowing something, it's that component is rewriting your narrative. So if you recognize you don't get something, then in some senses, in order for you to progress forward, you have to go through the journey of a new story from the old way into a new way so that that narrative can take you into a particular direction of new knowledge. And in acquiring that knowledge, the goal is actually to practice, which is the fourth stage of all critical learning. If you don't practice, you're only essentially as good as the last time you practiced. And even when you feel that you have mastery over something, the continual practice of something and the multiple iterative versions of it is where you develop new nuances as you become more wise with age. The fifth, and this is one that many of us actually overlook, is the post-mortem to any process. So when we learn something, we're reflecting, we're objectifying, we're learning a narrative or rewriting a narrative, we practice. But many of us skip this critical step in our self-leadership roles, in that we don't reflect in a post-mortem on what did we learn, what could we have learned better, what could I have done better in this instance, so that ultimately in that kind of self-evaluating, you can lead yourself into the next self-reflective practice, to the next thing that you're learning. And this is an ongoing cyclical iterative state over and over and over again, presumably through to the rest of your life, right? So in terms of the bigger picture, that is the essence of pivoting and walking, is that it's simple. Turn, look at the direction you're heading towards, and take one step further, over and over and over again. And the longer that you're walking, eventually you get there. You shorten the distance over time. Maybe you never get there because you're constantly trying to personally master that. But in that, it's very important to reflect back on learning from leaders so that you can self-lead yourself.